Hello, everyone, and welcome to Community Voice. This week's guest speaker is Olga. I'm going to say this wrong. Nikolai. Hopefully, I got that
Nikolaya,
right.
very good.
Thank you. And Olga has a business called dyingmatters.ca, and most of you would know who she is. She's a longtime chamber member and in the community as well now. She's been here for quite a few years, and she has expanded her business quite a bit. And I thought it'd be great today to have a chat with Olga and find out what's happening in her business. Maybe she can explain a little bit about who she is and what she does. And then she's going to have a brief discussion with us about grief in the workplace. So Olga, I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining us. And it's all yours.
Hi, Sherry. Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to provide some information around grief in the workplace. So I am by training an end-of-life nurse educator, and my business dyingmatters.ca provides death education as well as grief support. And now, because of our world the way it is, I'm offering support virtually. So oftentimes, using this kind of platform via Zoom or telephone to support community members through their grief journey. So what I wanted to provide to you today is very briefly in the next half an hour, hopefully only 20 minutes to go through the slides and then have some room for questions, is grief in the workplace. So how can we be able to better support ourselves and those that we work with as they're going through grief? So as you can see here on my slides, I'm going to go over a little bit of a history of grief, sort of looking at how history, especially industrialization, has really impacted the way in which people grieve in the workplace. I'm going to talk a bit about the impact of grief on the person. So really looking at the holistic perspective. So the impact that grief may have on the emotional, physical, mental, and spiritual aspect of the person. And then provide some ways that you can continue to support your employees, or how to be able to support yourself or people you work with in the workplace. So we're in probably, although the literature that I read said 150 years of industrialization, I think we're probably more in pushing on the 200 years of industrialization. And so what that means is that we've actually shifted very much our kind of work ethic, where especially now in the last probably last 2 years, because of the pandemic, so much of our work, what we would do potentially somewhere else in a different location outside of our home, is now in our own personal spaces. So that's an additional kind of influence and what we need to be aware of when we're attempting to provide support for people who might be grieving. So when you look at the history, it really is speaking to the fact that no longer are we in these maybe small family businesses where you might have a very small closed unit where people support each other in that way. Reflect onto these big industries where there's thousands of people, thousands of different policies and ways of managing the workplaces, and that has had a really big impact on, I think, a negative impact on the way in which many people feel kind of awkward or very vulnerable if they're to expose themselves or reveal that they're actually grieving, that something has happened, that they've had a loss, because loss can be not only for a person to die that has an impact on us, but some form of a loss. And then how to, I think people are feeling that they're not able to find a place where they can talk about those things. So oftentimes they will do what they can to kind of divide their grief and work. And sometimes that creates a lot of challenges for the person, or frustration. So we've also had this loss of these family connections as well, right? Over time, as we have decreased our family size, we may not have family too close that could provide some of that support. And that's another impact on the way in which we grieve. And I would also say that, even in my own lifetime, where we used to have, and many people still might still do, right? Have a 40-hour week where you go to work and then you come home, you decompress, and you have the time to not think about work. There's many of us that have really blended, our work and life. So many of us are working from home, like myself and Sherry. And again, that has an impact on our ability to grieve in the workplace, because there's not necessarily that separation, or sometimes there isn't even that balance. Sometimes in the corporate world, we're always on the phone, or our boss is asking us to be accessible at all times, to be writing emails in the middle of the night kind of thing. And I think that there's more of an expectation on employees from employers to do even more work. And so when there is a lack of providing some space for people, an acknowledgement of their maybe challenges or ways in which they're processing their grief, the cost is really on the employer as well as the employees. There's oftentimes a decrease in productivity. Errors are made. Sometimes spaces may not necessarily be safe, because it's sometimes difficult for the griever to even think straight, especially when they're in their acute process of grieving. And as a result of that, there's also a huge cost then on the person themselves. Oftentimes they feel very isolated, they feel very alone, which progresses their sadness into depression. So again, this really depressed mood, which often again may result in some complications in their grieving, especially if they may not have some of those supports to really validate and acknowledge and normalize their grieving process. So I'm going to guide you a little bit through kind of the spin of grief. But before we go into that, all you really need to do is, and a lot of the work that I do is really building compassion and empathy for people, so that we can have a better sense and maybe create some more safe and compassionate spaces for people to express their grieving. I just want you to reflect on your own grief experience. What that maybe somebody died in your family, maybe you had a really big move, maybe you lost a job. And so that, just to reflect on how that impacted you, right? How did you feel emotionally, physically, were you kind of scattered? Were you able to focus? Not? And what I'm really reflecting on is that impact has the impact of grief, as I said in my introduction, has an impact on our emotional aspects. So we may feel all kinds of different emotions, right? We may feel those kind of the fundamentals that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross identified in her work in the 60s and 70s. We might have some denial, we might feel numb, we might have anger, frustration, guilt, blame, shame. There might even be some relief, especially if maybe we were a caregiver for someone for a long time and have been witness to suffering. Grief also impacts us physically. We feel it in the body. Sometimes people, can have a lot of aches and pains in the physical body, and it's something that happens. It in our physiology, we get impacted by grief where it really elevates our stress response. And so the stress hormone cortisol starts to do its work. And that is why we become very anxious and almost like we're constantly on edge when we're in our acute grief process. Grief also impacts our mental abilities. So sometimes we may not be able to concentrate. Sometimes people say that they're in a fog. They can't really manage their thoughts. And so that again has a huge impact on whether or not a person can actually do the work that they've been tasked to do, because oftentimes those thought processes are not something that they can really control. And there's also an impact on their spiritual sense of self, depending on the type of loss that they have experienced. People may have have experienced a loss that was very traumatic, where there isn't always an understanding of why it happened. And so sometimes it'll bring us into asking these existential kind of questions. Why me? Why now? Is this going to last forever? And so as you see here, grief is really caused by the sense of loss. So as I said before, it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be somebody in your immediate family that dies. It could be the sense that something meaningful for you has been removed, that you no longer have a relationship with it. Grieving process is also influenced by your own experience with grief. So whether you have had a number of losses, sometimes that's indicative of how old you are. You know, the older you get, the potentially the more losses you will have experienced. But it also speaks to your own ability to adjust and adapt to that kind of loss. So whether you are more prone to be fragile, where you may not have a good sense of self, or whether you're more resilient. So you have the ability to adapt to change and be able to refocus and integrate a loss. And as I said, it impacts all of the different aspects of ourselves. So let's go through a few of these. So here's the journey. The journey through grief oftentimes sort of starts off with the person experiences loss. They may initially feel shock, and that sometimes is represented by them kind of feeling numb or even denying the fact, you know, I can't believe it, right? It can't be happening. And that's a normal, natural response. Sometimes we get a little hung up on they're in denial, but remember, oftentimes people will have all kinds of different experiences and different ways of experiencing their grief in the day. You might be capturing their particular shock point or their moment where they're kind of not able to come to understand that this has really happened. So they might be in that natural process of denial. Then sometimes what happens is if there's an increased shock, they might, again, some of the anger might come up, some of the stronger emotions, they might be looking for, yearning to find that person, and they might feel very confused and very disoriented, right? Again, if you reflect back on your own process of grief, oftentimes very close to after someone's death, let's just say this is a loss because of somebody that has died. Usually in that first week, there's a lot of emotion and a lot of feeling and a lot of impact on that acute grief experience. And then as you see going around that circle, there is eventually that process of reorganization where the person is looking for meaning, looking to reinvest back into life. And then they either will move towards recovery or they might circle back in on that grief wheel where they might again have more of a deterioration, especially if they feel that they're not being supported or their grief experience is not validated. So it's kind of it can be a vicious cycle. So I'm going to break down the impact on grief, on the different aspects and what that might look like for the person who's experiencing it and what that might look like in the workplace or how it can impact the workplace. And as you see here, the emotional impact is sometimes a person may feel very overwhelmed, really unable to even control their emotions. And again, just think about your own process of grief. It's hard sometimes to really kind of say, okay, now is not the time, because so much of grief, especially in that first week or that first month, can be triggered by smells, by sight, by somebody sounded like the person that has died, and is not always in the control of the person. And so the impact on the workplace might be that the employee may be a bit withdrawn and may not be able to even make decisions as they're in this phase of feeling numb or unable to kind of control their environment. The physical aspect, sometimes the person may feel very fatigued. Some people actually are more prone to illness, to having more colds, right? Their autoimmune system is a little bit depressed because of the stress hormone that's in their body. And so they really need to some time to rest, right? Just to settle down. That's why so many of the historical, and religious and faith-based support systems were really around gathering around the person, providing them with food, providing them with all of the support that they needed so they could really rest in that first week. So the impact on the workplace, what you might see is this thing called presenteeism, which means that the person is present in work, but they're not really mentally, emotionally, maybe even sort of physically there, right? So they're doing the job, but they're not really able to focus. And as a result of that might actually result in low productivity, not only for them, but then the impact of what they're not necessarily able to do in work has that larger impact on the workplace. The mental impact, again, I think I spoke about this already, but in more depth, this is person may lose their ability to really focus as their thoughts are kind of racing through their mind, as they might be looking back and kind of trying to make sense of what happened, and maybe even trying to look back to see, did they miss something? Was there something that they could have done, not have done? And a lot of that is really out of their control. Again, just think about your own losses and how sometimes you were in this mental fog. And so as a result of that, they sometimes lose the ability to really concentrate, to be focusing on one task, because sometimes it's helpful to distract oneself from the thoughts that are going on. And so the impact on the workplace then is it might be errors, or it may not even be safe, maybe for the person or for the other people that are in the environment, right? And this is not to say that a person will, their work will be negatively impacted. Is to have an awareness and the sensitivity that the reason why maybe they're creating errors is because they're grieving, right? Because even as the employer, let's say, I may not know that somebody is grieving, so I'm really paying attention and maybe offering up support, for my employees, and really paying attention to what's going on. And then there's also the impact of grief on the spiritual aspect. Let me see if I can, there it is, where the person may actually feel very hopeless or helpless. And that's really hard for the person who's experiencing it, but also potentially for coworkers, people who want to help because they actually can't fix. Oftentimes caregivers say, no, how can I fix this? And I say, you can't. This is a natural, normal process. And sometimes the person really what they need is to know that their grief is normal, natural, and that there's somebody there that is willing to sit with them, to support them through that process. So again, the person themselves may feel kind of lost, or as it says here, it might be a loss of innovation, right? Because they're not able to kind of expand and be hopeful and put their energy into the work. They might feel a little bit not as productive and may not be really happy because of it. So it may not necessarily be the job that they're doing, but the grief is then, all the work is being filtered through their grieving, and therefore they might be feeling unhappy at their workplace. So how can we support, and what are some resources in this particular community? So one of the things that I think is really advantageous is to offer up some bereavement support, some time off. Now, usually this is, again, something in our society I think that we need to shift a little bit, where sometimes the person will only have 3 days off work to manage some of the post-death, things that they have to get done. 3 days still doesn't necessarily give them the time to really be present with their grief, to integrate and to rejuvenate and to recharge. They sort of need a week. It's the natural process seems to be those 7 days, but certainly look at, how can you provide some bereavement support? If you're not able to offer the time off, maybe it's some education for your staff, for yourself, to educate yourself about grief and how you can support it, how it might be impacting all of those different aspects of the person, and how to support them in a good way. The other is potentially offering up some safe spaces at work. So if they are feeling stressed, they have a little place to go. So if they're still not at home or to, even if they are at home, that's where the flexibility comes in, to have some space for adjusting, for the person to take some time off so they can be with their grief and then refocus on the job and the work at hand. The other is really to build compassionate communities, which I think is part of doing these kinds of education, even if it's small, small amount of information, for us to be able to have some more insight on how we can support people who are grieving and who we're working with. There's a couple of resources. So Heart of Hastings, which is our residential and volunteer visiting hospice here in Madoc, has grief and bereavement support. There's also the Bereaved Families of Ontario that provides repository of support services. And of course, I also provide grief support in the community. Wow, those are my 20 minutes. Wow. I wanted to make sure that I provided some time for people that might have specific questions, as this is only a snapshot of what people may be experiencing and how we can support them.
That's great, Olga. Thank you so much for that. And I see we have a couple of guests with us today, so that's wonderful. And is there any questions for Olga from our audience today? I know that I would like to ask Olga, has anybody been in contact with this labor standards of Canada in regards to maybe changing the bereavement dates from 3? Because that's usually the standard HR policy. As I know that most companies just go with the standard with the labor standard rates of 3 days. So my question is, have we been in touch? Have your network of people that you deal with, have they been in touch with the labor standards to say, hey, look, times are changing. This is what's happening. This is what we're seeing. Can we get this amended to, to accommodate 7 days?
Absolutely. So I haven't personally, but I know that there's lots of folks who are working on some of that compassionate benefits. I know that federally we have extended some of the compassionate benefits for folks, especially for those that need to take a time off to care for someone at home, to be a caregiver. And I believe that those went from 8 weeks to 12 weeks, or even from 6 weeks to 12 weeks. So those were extended. I know that it actually took a lot of work to put that in place. So I have no doubt that somebody is working on that. There are folks that are working on extending bereavement leave, and even extending it not only for immediate family for those extended 7 days, but certainly for people maybe who aren't classified as immediate family, right? We oftentimes think about, my parents or my child or my spouse, or maybe even my brother, but maybe not my cousin or my friend. And if we look at, the complexities of families, I think we need to consider that as well, that families might have different types of units, right? Think about
Sure.
blended families, or even folks who may not necessarily have family, but have friends or other people that they're intimately close with. So under the law, they don't quite fit into being able to have some off time when they're going through their grieving process. And so many of those folks are going to be experiencing what is called disenfranchised grief, which is grief that isn't necessarily validated in the social landscape, right? It says you can only, if you're family, can you grieve. If you're not part of that family unit, too bad for you, right? So I think even though maybe at the policy level, there's pressure there to shift it, but I think there's also an opportunity for before we do that, or while we're waiting for some of those kind of changes, what else can we put in place, right? Yeah. How else can we support people as they're going through their grief process?
Right, yes. And would you recommend that most business owners should maybe look at possibly once a year looking at doing a grief counseling or even some kind of an educational session with their employees in regards to grief in the workplace? Would you recommend that?
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the more, and this is what I call grief literacy, right? So the more that we can learn about the grieving process and kind of step off the 5 stages that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross started us off with, we can then better understand the complexities of grief, right? And understand, how we can support people in all kinds of different ways. Absolutely.
Great.
Right? Because again, we've gotten to the point where maybe we haven't even really noticed what have we lost in our maybe our inability to ritualize some of the kind of process, right? Or not offering up some safe space within the workplace where people could, you know, be able to go and cry, or even, you know, how can we provide training so that when somebody comes to you and they're grieving, you know how to support them.
Excellent. Yes, that's true. So, okay. I see. I'm going to ask the audience again if they have any questions before we go. Our time is just about up, and I'll just reach out to everyone.
I have no questions, but I really appreciate this presentation. There's so much information that I think a lot of us do not even realize that's out there, or they don't understand that things like this happen. And it's kind of like the stress thing, is they just get over it, sort of thing. But yeah, I really appreciate the presentation.
You're welcome, Kathy.
Great. Glad to hear. So anyways, I'm going to say thank you to Olga for joining us this week on Community Voice, and I hope you'll come back again. And thank you, audience, for tuning in, and we will see you next week. Have a great week, everyone.
Thank you.
You're welcome.